And welcome back to Racing Rundown. This is another one of the two things that we're going to have this week for the Kentucky Derby Trail. We're going to have our second Kentucky Derby Power 5 of 2023. Also coming later this week. We did it last week, but with the major shakeup that happened Saturday night, we're going to obviously re-record that. But I'm also, and as you can tell by the title, we're also joined by our friend Jay Privman once again. So this is the second time I think we've talked to you, obviously the second time we've talked to you in 2023. I think we did a little bit of Kentucky Derby coverage when we were talking about Forte in the context of the Breeders' Cup episode, the Eclipse Award episode back in January. But it's a pleasure to have you back on again, Jay. Glad to welcome you.
No, thanks again, Jack, for having me on.
And so we'll start off with the elephant in the room right now is Forte, who has... some have viewed him as the leader the entire way, and it's absolutely rightfully earned in that aspect with what Forte has done. But there was also competition with how brilliant Arabian Night had been in his two starts. But with the news that he is no longer contesting the Kentucky Derby, Forte emerges from that, emerges out of that news as the clear, at this point, at least leader on the Kentucky Derby Trail. There's certainly other talented horses, and we'll get to that, but he, a couple weeks ago, last week, returned after his Breeders' Cup victory at a very professional, I would describe it, victory in the Fountain of Youth. And we'll start there, Jay. What did you think of Forte's first start back in 2023 from his championship 2022 season?
Yeah, I thought it was a really solid comeback effort, Jack, and that, he won his best, but it still looked like he had room to move forward. And I think that's what you want with your first start of the year coming off of a 4-month layoff, is to show that you've progressed from 2 to 3, but not empty out the tank when the major goal is still a couple months away. So I thought it was really an ideal comeback race, and it looks like he'll have one more start prior to the Kentucky Derby, that being in the Florida Derby. And, to me, to this point, everything's gone right for him, and even before Arabian Night went to the sidelines, to me, he was the deserving favorite for the race, being as he was the 2-year-old champion. So he sits atop the board, and I think rightly so. There's certainly plenty of others in this crop that look like they've got some promise, but I do think he is the rightful deserving favorite as of right now.
And we'll move on to another horse from the Todd Pletcher barn, a little bit more recent than Forte, but Tapit Trace last weekend took out the Tampa Bay Derby, and there was a lot of divided opinions in racing circles about Tapit Trace. Some really, really liked the victory, took into account the fact that he didn't have a great start and took him a while to get going, and then there were others, and I am still having trouble placing myself in which camp I'm in, but it certainly did look like it was a bit on the slower side. So he has, I still think, I would say it's still fair to say he has major questions at this point. But what did you think of Tapit Trace's effort last weekend in the Tampa Bay Derby?
It was a strange race because midway through the race, it looked like he was getting nothing. He was under a pretty aggressive ride from Luis Saez, and he just didn't look like he was going anywhere. But then once he took hold, he really finished the race off well. So he looks like he's kind of what you often get with offspring of Tapit early in their career, an immature horse who still has some growing up to do mentally. But if and when he puts it together, I think there's a lot of upside there. I think he's going to improve with racing. His next scheduled start is going to be the Bluegrass, and I think that's going to be a really pivotal race for him to see if he comes forward from the Tampa Bay Derby. He needs to break better. He needs to be in a little bit better, I think, early position to subsequently have success in the Kentucky Derby. And I think the Bluegrass is going to be a really important race to see how much he's come forward, if at all, but hopefully for his sake, he has, from the Tampa Bay Derby, and that would in turn set him up to be a top contender for the Kentucky Derby.
Brad Cox has a large contingent of 3-year-olds and could potentially have a good number making the Kentucky Derby. My prediction throughout the course of the winter has been he'll saddle 4 horses on the first Saturday in May. That prediction aside, I wanted to ask you. We'll get into a few of his horses right now, but Instant Coffee's the first one I want to get into, and he's a horse that I have never really been, at least in his 2 races since the Breeders' Futurity, I haven't been fully blown away by them, but at the same time, he seems like one of these horses that you get fairly often on the Kentucky Derby Trail, that it's never the most pretty in the way he gets the job done, but the horse gets the job done. And I'm curious if that might be your read of Instant Coffee, or if you have another view of him going forward into the Louisiana Derby.
Yeah, I think he's a nice, solid horse. He'll be coming into the Louisiana Derby off of a 2-month break after winning the Lecomte, which I thought was a fairly average field for a Derby prep. The Louisiana Derby should be a stronger field, and I think that'll really, tell the tale with where Instant Coffee stands among this group. I think he's going to have to progress from the Lecomte to win the Louisiana Derby, and I'll be interested to see if he can take that step forward, because I think he's going to be meeting a lot better company in the Louisiana Derby than what he faced in the Lecomte. And that was just a race that I thought was fine, but it wasn't anything that made me go, boy, that's a real serious Derby horse right there.
And we'll go to, I want to go now to a couple of the horses that Brad Cox has run up in New York. Hit Show back in February won the Withers, and then Cox also had Slip Mahoney, who ran second in the Gotham behind the upset, or unofficially second behind the upset winner of that race, Raise Cane. So I want to ask you your thoughts on specifically Hit Show, but since we're bringing in Aqueduct, I also will slip Mahoney there as well.
So I really liked Hit Show's race. I thought he won well. I think he's going to love whatever distance they throw at him, being by Candy Ride. I think he's a really good horse, and I'm really interested to see his next race. I think he's got a lot of upside to him. Slip Mahoney, to me, is more of your classic late-running one-turn horse, and I think the Withers was a race that kind of unfolded to flatter horses the Gotham, I should say, flattered horses with that kind of style. The winner Raise Cane, for instance, and then Slip Mahoney as well. I'm not sure those horses are going to be as effective going out to a 2-turn 1 1/8 and obviously a 1 1/4 for the Derby kind of situation.
In a few weeks, the Arkansas Derby is going to go off, and we'll head down to there. And the Rebel was a bit of an interesting race, I thought, with how it played out, because you had a Confidence Game in Red Route 1. A couple of the lesser regarded horses in that race run 1-2 there, but they did have good form back to the efforts that they ran behind Arabian Night and Arabian Night's victory in the Southwest. But Reincarnate, who's one of the West Coast horses, who we can touch on here, but if you'd like, we can wait to save him for when we get to the horse out on the West Coast. But in addition to Reincarnate, also there, Verifying was favored in that spot out of his very fine allowance victory. So, just your thoughts in general about the horses exiting the Rebel.
I'm not sure what to make of the race, though I did think of all of them, I'd probably want Reincarnate 2 months from now. He just strikes me as a horse who he wants every bit of a 1 1/4, that's for sure. He's continuing to improve. He's not a flashy kind of horse. He's kind of a grinder, but I think he's the kind of horse that is going to want more distance. And he didn't have the cleanest trip in that race. So I think he's got some room to improve. Confidence Game's a little bit of a mystery. He had a bit of a trip in his race before the Rebel, and I thought won well enough in the Rebel, but there's been some questions about him since the race in terms of when he's going to run again. He missed a workout that was scheduled. So I'm just not really sure where he's at right now. And Red Route 1, the horse who finished second in that race. He is a horse who is continuing to progress. He's another one who wants more distance. He might be a little more pace dependent than Reincarnate, but he's by Gun Runner. He's trained by Steve Asmussen, and that's top connections when it comes to this time of year, or really any time of year. So I kind of like the horses who chased Confidence Game going forward more than I like Confidence Game. It's not a knock on Confidence Game. I'm just kind of, projecting where these horses are going to be the first Saturday in May as opposed to right now in mid-March.
And now we'll go out to the West Coast. And I would like to start with Practical Move, who I thought was a very strong winner of the San Felipe. His Los Alamitos Derby Los Alamitos Futurity kind of perplexed me a little bit, because I thought, I obviously wasn't the only person here, but I was expecting to see a lot better from Arabian Lion, and I was wondering if that was going to kind of be, just a race that the a couple of the horses that finished in 1-2 in that race were going to bounce out and, just be whatever. But I really, and I'll give myself a little bit of credit on here. In the couple of weeks leading up to the San Felipe, I really started to think a little bit better of Practical Move. And, just in general, your thoughts about him, obviously the San Felipe, but going forward towards the Santa Anita Derby and even further, if I can get those from you.
Yeah, I liked his Los Alamitos Futurity. I thought it was a nice, solid win. But the San Felipe was a much better performance and really showed to me that he's progressed from 2 to 3 over those 2.5 months or so between those two starts. I thought it was a tremendous race. He won his best. He got a really strong buyer speed figure of 100. And his next race will be the Santa Anita Derby, for which he looks like he's the rightly the favorite right now for this race. The only thing in the back of my mind that's just slightly concerning to me is that he's by Practical Joke, and that's not something that makes you think he's a 1.25 mile type horse, but he runs like he's a 1.25 mile type horse, and a lot of times that's just more important than what the pedigree says. But that's the one thing that just keeps me from completely dieting all in on him is the top side of that pedigree. But based on what I saw in the San Felipe, I think he's rock solid.
And I want to ask you about the runner-up from that race, Go Rocket Ride. Richard Mandella is well known for not being the type of trainer to push a horse to the Kentucky Derby if that particular horse isn't ready for it. And he was a very aggressive spotting for him out of a maiden victory, but he ran a very strong second in the San Felipe, and I'm curious what you thought about him coming out of that race.
I thought it was an amazing performance. It's just so hard to do something like that off a debut sprint win, go 2 turns, running against seasoned horses and the best in California at the time, and to finish a solid second in that race, I thought was a terrific effort. I just don't know what that's going to mean in terms of his next race. A lot of times when you ask a horse to do something like that in their first couple starts, they run well in that second start, and then it takes its toll in start number 3. And that's going to be the thing for me to watch when he comes back in the Santa Anita Derby. Can he come back off of that tough second race where he was thrown in against the best of the division in California, ran as hard as he could? How does he react to having all that thrown at him? He does have the pedigree to continue to progress, but he's being asked to do a lot in a short amount of time, and some horses can handle that, but most can't. And I have the utmost respect for Richard Mandella. I don't think he's going to do anything that he doesn't think this horse is capable of doing. But that's the thing that that gives me trepidation about him going into the Santa Anita Derby, is how is he going to react to having so much thrown at him in such a short amount of time?
Another horse that's going to have some questions going in the Santa Anita Derby is National Treasure, and he unfortunately had to come out of the San Felipe. Last I heard, and if I'm wrong on this, please be sure to correct me, but I believe he's still going to press forward on the Kentucky Derby trail, and he's certainly, the one thing in his corner is even though he did miss the San Felipe, and you are concerned in that he doesn't have a start going back to the Sham, he did have... he did have a few runs as a 2-year-old, so you're not necessarily that much worried about experience, but certainly the missed time is something that would be cause for concern. So I'm curious if he does make the Santa Anita Derby, what your thoughts for National Treasure would be. He's obviously a horse who's been very consistent in his stakes runs, but there are going to be those questions and factors in front of him going forward.
Yeah, it's a lot to ask. It's hard to miss critical races at this point in the run up to the Derby and still be effective when it comes to the Kentucky Derby, because you're running against usually horses who haven't had hiccups. And so you're taking the worst of it. So unless you're so much better than everybody else, I think it's really a tough task to overcome that kind of a setback. And in the case of National Treasure, his Sham to me was just very average. I'm still not sure he's a classic mile-and-a-quarter kind of horse, even though he's by Quality Road. He's got the pedigree that would suggest he is, but his juvenile was good, but he didn't look to me in the Sham like he'd come forward enough. And now you've got a horse who had a foot issue going into the San Felipe that caused him to be scratched from that race, which means that if he does run in the Santa Anita Derby, he'll be coming into that race not having run in 3 months, having missed a key scheduled prep for that. So I would be fading him right now.
And there's one more horse that I would like to ask you about, and he's not going to be able to earn points on the Kentucky Derby Trail, but Bob Baffert is sending Worcester over to the United Arab Emirates to run in the UAE Derby, and I'm curious what if you had any thoughts on his third place effort in the Bob Lewis, but also his runner-up effort in his second career start where he was beaten by Hijazi in the maiden race at Santa Anita. And just, even though he is a maiden, what you think of his chances potentially in placing in a race like that?
Yeah, I'd have to see who else ends up in that race, but I think just the fact that they're sending him there tells you what they think of him. If they thought he was a legitimate Kentucky Derby horse, he would not be going to the UAE, and he would not be staying with Baffert at this stage, owing to Baffert's suspension for this year's Derby by Churchill Downs. He would have moved into another barn. So, running second to Hijazi, it was a decent race, but Hijazi has not progressed like you would have wanted him to, at least in terms of being a two-turn horse. And the Bob Lewis was kind of an intramural race with 4 Baffert horses, and somebody had to be third and fourth. It was so I just think he's okay. I don't know that he's anything special, and to me, whether he has success in the UAE Derby or not would just really depend on what else shows up there. And it's just impossible to make a prediction like that without seeing who, for instance, comes over from Japan, or who the locals that Godolphin has, for instance, run in that race. So I would just sort of punt on that opinion right now. But he's not a horse that gets me all warm and fuzzy at this point of his career.
And I guess to end off, are there any other horses that we didn't touch on that you have thoughts on that you think, okay, this might be a horse to keep an eye on, step up in a final prep and pick up those 40 or even 100 points to get into the Kentucky Derby starting gate?
I just have the utmost respect for John Sheriffs as a trainer, and having seen the way he has horses progress over time, like he did with Giacomo, for instance, when he won the Kentucky Derby. I wouldn't give up on Skinner just yet, even though he was just third best in the Santa Anita Derby. I think he's going to continue to move forward. He's by Curlin, and that to me is certainly a Derby kind of sire line. And I think this horse is going to continue to come forward, not only because of what kind of a horse he is, but knowing what kind of a trainer John Sheriff's in, and how he uses prep races as building blocks for the for the main target. So that's one that I would use. And then the other one that I kind of like is he's going to have to step up in terms of his speed figs, but I really like the way Kings Barnes won an allowance race for Pletcher in the Tampa Bay Derby, and he's supposed to go next in the Louisiana Derby. And he's a horse that I've got my eye on. I think he's better than he might be ranked at this point by a lot of the Derby lists that I've seen. So those would be the two that I would put in the context of the question that you asked.
All right. Well, it's always a pleasure to be able to talk to you. We appreciate the time that you're able to give us this episode.
Anytime. Thanks, Jack.